also recording the event as of now, and the recording of the event will be made available as well through both myself and the Congresswoman. All right. So it is 5:01. Let's get started. So my name is Alderwoman Maria Hadden. I'm Alderwoman here in the 49th Ward, and I'm joining you here with our Congresswoman extraordinaire, Jan Schakowsky. Jan, would you like to say a few words of greetings before I go over our rules?
I'm just so proud to be with you, Maria, our Alderwoman of the 49th Ward. That this is part of the 9th Congressional District, and I really, really look forward to this conversation that we're going to be having today, and look forward to the questions that we're going to be getting. So thanks for setting this up, Maria.
No, thank you so much. We're lucky to have you as a representative, and I'm very happy to do this, this town hall with you virtually. So for all of our attendees, I want to just kind of go over a few of our guidelines and then a bit of the agenda. So we're going to both start off sharing some updates from our particular offices around police accountability, what we're doing in this moment, what's happening legislatively, certainly from our differing perspectives. So we'll spend about half the time sharing some of those updates and giving you the latest news. And then we're going to be taking questions. So you'll be able to submit questions to us through the Q&A function that's available. And we do have staff that are monitoring those questions so that we can get to the Q&A portion after our presentations. If there are questions that, if we don't get to your question directly, we're going to be doing our best to answer questions when we see similar ones come up. And if there are things that we don't get to during our hour together, so we are going until 6, if we don't get to your question, we'll follow up with those questions in written responses through our social media accounts, and also when we share the town hall videos through our newsletter platforms. So thank you for attending. And thanks to our teams, Leslie Combs, Leslie Perkins, Caleb Stevens, for our staff who are making this possible, because it takes more than 1 or even 2 people to successfully host a virtual town hall. So with that, I would like us to start with Congresswoman Schakowsky. Please share some updates with us on what you're working on.
So I'm going to give you updates, but I thought I would just begin by telling you where I'm coming from on this issue. And I am completely convinced that we have to rethink policing. There has not been one period in the history of the United States of America that we have not seen violence and force being used by the police. And in fact, the history of the police has been the development of their job to return slaves that had escaped. And that's where policing actually got started. And so I think we're making a good start. I'll talk to you about the legislation, but just a couple of issues I want to talk to you about. The Washington Post did a study and found that about 1,000 people are killed by the police every year, and it's been pretty steady over the last 5 years, regardless of the headlines, regardless of even demonstrations that have happened in the meantime. Eric Garner, and I know it was a bit, and Ferguson, and things that have happened when people have taken to the street. But nothing seemed to have really changed over that period. The spending nationwide for policing is about $100 billion every year. And in Chicago, about $1.6 billion. And so I think it really is time to understand exactly what do the police do. Again, a report that I saw said about 1% have to do with felonies, real crimes. And the rest has to do with things like responding to noise complaints, issuing parking and traffic tickets, taking accident reports, responding to people who have overdosed, rounding up homeless people and after property owners complain, arresting children for bad behavior, so-called, and so the question is there really any reason for an armed police force to do those activities? These are the kinds of questions that I really think that we need to raise, and I'm looking forward to being part of that conversation. We also know that arrests actually have not made communities safer. They've had a dramatic effect on individuals, but have not necessarily, well, have not really made communities safer. And so again, these are the questions that we have to raise. But I am very proud that the Congressional Black Caucus, along with the Judiciary Committee, introduced legislation, the Justice in Policing Act, that I think at least addresses some of the critical issues that we have. It bans outright chokeholds. The president said that it should be banned unless the officer thinks that his life is in danger, which is this huge gaping hole through which people could be killed. Stops no-knock warrants, which we've seen a murder there, a death there. Ends the qualified immunity doctrine, which has really been a tool to let law enforcement, any police officer, off the hook. In other words, even get away with murder. It combats racial profiling, mandates data collection, which is very, very important, including and requires body cams and dashboard cams, and establishes new standards for police. So there are some, and these aren't just suggestions. These are changes in the law that law enforcement has to abide by. I wanted to say one other thing. I was looking at the history of the chief of police here in Chicago, not chief of police, I'm sorry, the president of the union of police, who is actually right now on supervision, or, you know, I think he can't actually act as a, am I right, Maria? He can't even act as a law enforcement officer right now.
Police duties are frozen.
Yeah, he's president of the Fraternal Order of Police, Lodge 7. He's had multiple incidents that have caused him to be put put on hold. I don't know what exactly the right word is. Lots of complaints. He was actually put on his website that he supported Trump's criticism of the, including Colin Kaepernick and the sports figures that took a knee. And he made a lot of comments that he said, I wouldn't take it back for anything. And so there is definitely an attitude that we, you know, it's a cultural issue too when it comes to policing that we have to combat, because it does appear from all the evidence that we see that there is built-in racism here, systematic, long-term racism embedded very often, most often. This is not a matter of one or two bad apples. This is an issue crying out for fundamental change. And this is the last thing I'll say to begin with, which is I believe this is a moment of transition, a moment of transformation. And I think that the outpouring pouring of people on the street, the outpouring is going to make a big difference. The fact that Black and white and brown people together and Asian Americans have been marching, have been protesting, is the moment. This is our moment. And I look forward to working with all of you to make this happen, working with the community. Thanks, Maria. Thanks, Alderwoman.
No, thank you so much. Many of the information you shared and kind of grounding us in this conversation around police accountability, I couldn't have said better myself. We are, when we're talking about police accountability, when we're approaching this conversation, especially as legislators and folks in elected office, we need to ground it in the history, right? Institutions that we build, whether they be departments within city governments or the whole of our government itself, we need to understand the design and the function in order to look at how we want to redesign it. There are many conversations happening within our city and within our ward. People have been calling for a defunding of the police department. People have been calling for an abolishment of the police department. Some people are calling for reforms of the police department. And I think in that spectrum of actions that people want leadership to take, the first and most important thing is people want us to take action. We're all coming from a place of understanding that what we're doing, how we allow our police departments to function, what we allow as the state isn't working. And as a matter of fact, it's not just working, it's killing people. I really appreciate some of the figures you shared around how we're using police, what they're even doing. And I'll reflect on our new superintendent, Brown, mentioned a couple of weeks ago even that these police officers were tired. They found themselves responding to a lot of things that really weren't police oriented. So I think this is a moment and a space where we can talk about how we reimagine what public safety looks like. I know here in the ward, it's only been a year, but we've had some conversations around really redefining what public safety looks like. You know, what are alternatives to calling police officers? Just had outreach today from a resident and both an individual resident, but also someone part of a community organization in our ward who was reaching out for some possible solutions to alternatives to calling police on, people experiencing homelessness. A commercial neighbor of theirs is calling police on a homeless person who is, they're just homeless. We have wonderful organizations that provide services that can do wellness checks. And I think when it comes down to some of our accountability conversations, we're also looking at how we're spending our money. So in Chicago, we spend about $5 million a day on police services. So this isn't the whole of public safety. It's not firefighters and paramedics and, other kind of traffic safety folks. It's just on policing. We spend that much in a year roughly on mental health services. And so when we look at how we can better meet the needs of residents in our cities, in our states, and our country, I think there's a really clear step forward, which is we need to stop spending so much money on policing, and we need to spend more money on our social services and on our economic development. I heard from a resident via social media early last week who really wanted us to start talking about that as part of the situation. It's not just about more mental health services. It's not just about more social workers. It's also about investing in communities that we have divested from when it comes to economic development, providing opportunities, jobs, better education. I hear this from residents across the board. We received over 10,000 emails over the last week with people asking for this type of accountability. And then the other side of police accountability for residents is, as far as conversations that we're having in the city, many of you are aware, because some of you are part of Network 49 and have been a deep part of this work, but we're also in the middle of a consent decree. So in addition to thinking about how governments make decisions about how we're spending on services, policing, and how we're promoting public safety, there's also the portion within Chicago where we have a long history and we've been struggling for decades on how we change police accountability and hold officers accountable for police abuses. From John Burge to the Laquan McDonald murder, we've got blood on our hands. The city of Chicago has blood on our hands. This consent decree is the latest in some methods of strong reforms. The mayor has announced another use of force task force. Some people are skeptical of whether that's going to lead to anything different. And Congresswoman, you echoed that in your own remarks of a lot of reforms. We go through these cycles of reforms and we don't come out with different solutions. So I would agree with you. I think we're in a time and in a moment where we need to start from scratch. We need to look like what it looks like to build a different public safety system, and what it looks like to reimagine the way we spend our dollars in the city. And for residents of the 49th Ward who happen to be joining, I've heard many of you asking me for support of Civilian Police Accountability Council, CPAC. I am a supporter. It's something I am definitely behind. And also following up on meaningful things that City Council can do. I'm proud to have been a co-sponsor of legislation introduced by Alderman Sawyer, Alderman Ramirez Rosa, and Alderman Taylor today to end our contract as the City of Chicago to bring police out of CPS schools. So that ordinance was introduced today, and I'm definitely going to be working towards that. And these are the types of steps that I think we need to take action to demonstrate to you guys that we hear you and that we understand that the same old reforms will not produce the results that we deserve. So, yeah. So I'm going to come to a few. I know we've answered a few of the questions for folks who are joining us here. And Jan, I figure we can kind of keep chatting back and forth here. But you can use the Q&A function if you're here as an attendee. And I am monitoring our chat box here. Let's see. All right, we've got a question from Kelsey Marks, and this is for you, Congresswoman Schakowsky. Let's see. While legal reform can be effective, another key aspect is the current culture within law enforcement agencies. How can we ensure that law enforcement officers have the faculties to hold each other accountable when they notice issues are occurring internally?
Well, there needs to be a requirement that those who observe improper behavior are required to report it. You know, the officer that, or murderer, whatever you want to call him, that in the George Floyd situation, two of the others that were with him were brand new on the force, you know, very short time. And so they looked to him as a role model. So inappropriate, unacceptable behavior has to be identified. And then officers who observe it have to report it. But it's not just a matter of training. I just want to say that, because every time this happens, there are discussions about sensitivity training, et cetera, and use of force, which is certainly an important conversation. But we just have to set new standards and new values that accompany policing, and redefine policing in a way that not all the, you know, that police officers, armed police officers, don't have to do all of these other functions that could be spread out into control by the communities that they're in. And so, you know, but I do think requiring other officers who witness this kind of information, that they have to be required to report it or be held accountable themselves.
Yeah. No, absolutely. That culture change piece, I would agree with you, Jan. We're going to have to redefine um, what public safety is and what policing is in order for that to change. We've got some good questions coming in here, so I want to. I've got two questions that have come up about CPAC, so I'm going to take and answer that. So CPAC is one piece of legislation that was entered to get civilian police accountability. And we've got questions about what's the best way to put pressure on the mayor to get that CPAC legislation out of rules. And if CPAC was passed by City Council, what would happen next? Some folks have heard issues about constitutionality. So to take that, I'll say the best thing, I know a lot of folks have been emailing and calling. You can call and email the mayor. Give her the reasons. Give her the reasons why you believe CPAC is the legislation we need. For those of you who are in the 49th Ward, I'm already on board, so please stop calling me. You don't have to call me anymore, but I will say,
Woman, could you tell what is the function of this oversight CPAC board?
absolutely, sure. So this is about getting an actual elected civilian board who would have oversight on everything from policy to being able to weigh in on police misconduct rulings as well, but really looking at having a representative community-based body of people elected from around the city who would have more oversight over the police. We've heard people say that the mayor, the police board, IPRA, COPA, all the different mechanisms that we've created in the city aren't doing a good enough job at actually bringing justice and holding people accountable. And so that we need civilian police oversight. There have been a couple of proposals over the years that involve civilian police oversight. There's another proposal on the table that's referred to as GAPA, which also includes civilian police oversight. Some folks don't feel like it gives enough control to the civilians, and it still puts a lot of power with the mayor. And so that's what I hear from residents and why I'm a supporter of CPAC currently, because we need the civilian control. So if you're not from the 49th Ward, if you're from other places in the district, talk to your alderman, get those conversations and put the pressure on, and we'll work to get it out of rules. I think a lot of issues as far as the question around constitutionality, we've been in active talks, multiple aldermen with organizers from the different groups, and many of the issues have been resolved. We've got some new versions, and I think we can get CPAC now. So I want to move on to another question, and Jan, this is for you. What are the next steps for the Justice and Policing Act?
We're going to have a vote next week. And I believe it's going to be a week from Friday, either Thursday or Friday of next week. We're going to have a vote. It's going to pass. The Republicans offered their own piece of legislation today, which is not nearly as strong. And as I said, the president also offered a plan. And I'm digging around here for the bill that the Republicans introduced. They have adopted some of the things that that Democrats have. They adopted an idea by Bobby Rush, who had a bill, I think, creating. I'm not sure, but like the first thing it says, encourage police departments to ban practices like chokeholds and no-knock warrant. Encourages? Are you kidding me? You know, these are the kinds of things that have to be mandated. I know that they took up an idea by Congresswoman Frederica Wilson to create a commission to study the conditions facing Black men and boys, and that's going to be in the bill. Oh, they have taken up. Bobby Rush had a bill to outlaw lynching, which didn't pass the Senate.
Yes, because of one person, right?
Didn't that, well, yes. One person who held up even having a vote. But this would make lynching a federal crime, and it's linked to Bobby Rush's Emmett Till Anti-Lynching Act. So that would be there. But I mean, think about that for a minute, that we were not able to, in 2020, pass a law yet that says that lynching, and let's face it, some of the things we saw, you could classify as modern day lynching. And so it is necessary to do it. But, you know, we're talking about thousands of people in this country, in our country's history, who have been lynched for refusing to get off the sidewalk when a white person was walking by. It was just amazing. Anyway, so that there are some things that are decent in their bill, but some of them are just recommendations, and that's not sufficient.
And Jan, just one quick follow-up there. Who didn't vote in favor of the anti-lynching bill?
No, it was, oh gosh. Bob, are you in the kitchen? No, it was not a vote.
Right?
What?
He it was a procedural move. It was Rand Paul, right?
Yeah, but that's it. Sorry. The Rand Paul, in the Senate, one person can withhold a vote, can stop a vote.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not just that he voted no. If there had been a vote and he voted no, it likely would have passed. But he decided to put a hold, as they say, on the legislation altogether. And so we'll get past that this time, I believe, I think.
Yeah.
I don't know that he has any plans to put holds on. That would be
mortifying,
I think,
unwise.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, we're getting some other good questions here. So we're going to get through as many of these as possible. So I'm going to try and group these. We've got a question about, that's a city question about whatever happened to the violence interrupters. It's a question from Facebook. How do we get those guys back? Certainly it's nice to try and divert resources to more social services, but what do we do about violent crime now if we're looking at alternatives to the Chicago Police Department? I think that's a great question. And while some of this might be specific to local, I'm sure, Jan, if you've got thoughts or comments to put here, speaking specifically to the violence interrupters, that program became Cure Violence. And I will say we do have one North Side and Metropolitan Family Services. We actually have some of the, what used to be known as the violence interrupters programs that serve Rogers Park and Uptown. Got some great folks, Ralph Edwards and his team keep in contact with our office and do a lot of outreach and building relationships with young folks to kind of just like stop conflicts and help people think before conflicts start. I'll say a lot of that is around interpersonal conflict. As far as other alternatives, we've got some really good models around the country and the world. And someone here's got, I'm going to wrap in Esther's question here about the model implemented in Camden, New Jersey. I know that's, folks have been hearing about that a lot, where they dismantled their existing system and started over. I think the question, there's interventions and social services that we could bring into the picture for interventions when we look at domestic violence, when we look at interpersonal violence, maybe physical fights, assaults, things like that. There are folks, I think, that people want to call that aren't going to take their interpersonal conflict person directly to jail. Building up systems where there can be those interventions where jailing is a last resort are some of the models that are out there. And then a lot of what happens with violent crime, and Jan kind of mentioned this, that, we're looking at very small percentages. A lot of what we rely on police now for violent crime, it's not preventing violent crime, it's trying to solve crime after it happens. And so right now, interpersonal development, investing in social services, violence interruption programs that really aim to change people's behaviors are some of the best models we have to preventing crime. And really, we think of the police as making us safe, but so much of what we really rely on them for is kind of solving crimes after they happen. So I know that's not a perfect answer there. And, as we look at different models and what we can do, I think that Canva New Jersey model is a great example of them taking down a system that didn't work and building something new. But I also want to lift up that example, as I've read about it over the last couple of days, as not being a perfect system.
No.
And it's continuing, they're still needing to make changes. And I think that's another important thing when we look at systems and processes, especially within government, they're ever changing. We need to monitor, evaluate, and we need to adapt them to continue to serve us. And I think that's one of the biggest problems we have right now around policing. We haven't done those significant changes to serve our needs for the now.
I mean, we have to measure what's effective. And we know that violence interrupters have been very effective in many communities. I mean, that's really the only thing we should look at is it working? Does it really help to make us safer? And if it doesn't, then we have to undo it or redo it.
Mm-hmm. No, absolutely. Let's see. Here's a question from Karen. Seems to be the case that police unions can be one of the biggest roadblocks to change in police culture. How can we force change upon them if they refuse to even acknowledge the problem?
Yeah, I mean, I'll just take a crack at that. If we're looking at culture, maybe we don't have to look any further than what is the culture within the union. And what is the leadership saying to the membership of the union? And so, we can see right now that we're at least, we're in a difficult situation right now with the president of the police union. And if he wants to create a culture, it's not one that is really helpful for the kind of change that we need. And it's reflective of the membership. Then he got 55% of the vote and beat the incumbent. And he's 25 years on the force, as I said, on and off. I mean, in terms of his ability to go to the community. So this is definitely a problem. And as our Alderwoman said, it's about insisting on changing laws, but also changing the culture.
And I'll add to that and then bring in another question here. It falls upon us as leaders as well to set the examples of what we'll accept and what we won't. And it's something that I think has been left for too long in Chicago, that we haven't seen enough of people in elected and other community leadership positions calling out unacceptable behavior, racist behavior, that code of silence. And we're seeing more of that. Like in the last few years, we've definitely seen more of that. And in addition to calling things out, we've got to take action. And that will bring me to another question here. And a comment.
Can I just say, I'm a labor union member myself, SCIU, my union is part of it. And I would like to see, I hope that organized labor itself would take some responsibility and in weighing in this conversation in some way. I like to think of people who belong to a union as brothers and sisters, and we're fighting for the rights of workers. But this is, I think, an outlier here. And I think labor itself ought to somehow weigh in.
Yeah. Um, Lauren Thomas here says, first and foremost, many thanks to us both for taking the time to meet with our constituents. She appreciates our perspectives on this critical issue. Very glad to hear about the work our offices are doing, and is asking if you and I are in support of legislation on all levels of government that would require cuts to law enforcement budgets, so those funds could go to the social services that would get to serving these other functions. And do we both agree maybe that these other functions shouldn't be in the hand of police? And also, why doesn't the Justice Act include provisions that would directly address economic and health disparities currently being borne on people of color? And I'm kind of looping this in because we're getting a couple of questions kind of around the action piece, right? And so I'm going to group in and have us both kind of respond or share our thoughts on this, Jan. On there's the question of, divesting or defunding. What are kind of differences there? So direct things about taking money out of police budgets, putting them to other things. And there's questions on the table here around police contracts, right? And are there actions we can take around those police contracts?
Mm-hmm.
And there's also
Yeah.
questions about the licensing. So a few folks have asked about what we're able to do as far as licensing police. So I know there's a few different topics, but I'm looking at 2 screens of questions, and I thought I'd just put those on the table.
A good job. I think that we do need to spend less on what we think of as traditional policing and police departments. And until we redefine the job, and some of them that may be just totally outside of calling it the police department, we definitely have to fund uh, other things that actually would reduce crime in communities. As an organizer, most of my adult life, seems to me that empowering and funding local community organizations to take many of the, or at least a good number of the functions that are now done in police. It's not about making police friendlier when they arrest people. I remember officer friendly and my kids were growing up. Oh, come on, every family that has African-American children, especially boys, has to have the conversation. And it's not about officer friendly. It's about how you can prevent yourself from getting hurt. So yes, I think we need to spend less on what we've called traditional policing. I think we need to distribute money in a different way to make our communities safer.
Yeah. And I'll say, I saw a yes to what Jan just said. And on the questions of other actions that, at least at the city level, we can take, because I will say it's my understanding that a lot of the meaningful actions around police departments do have to be taken when we look at our own departments. Have to be they're local issues, right? So Chicago Police Department, we've got Chicago decisions to make. There are some things we can change at the state level as well. So the FOP contract is a big boulder in our path. They're a big boulder in our path to kind of meaningful change. And, it is concerning that the new FOP president, I listened to an interview he did recently, just doesn't seem to even be on the same page as the grand majority of residents in the city and what we're asking for. I saw in Minneapolis, and this was the same in New Jersey, that, one of the moves of creating a totally different public safety department and model, also we could just decide to end our contract with the FOP. And I know that might sound pretty drastic for folks. And also, this is the place that we're in. If we are charging folks with our safety, If we are in charge of deciding what that safety looks like, we have the responsibility to make some tough decisions. Some folks have been asking about what they could do to support us in making these decisions. We've got a question here. Let's see, I lost it here, about from Matt, about a lot of things kind of seem wrapped up with the mayor, who's currently only suggesting training as a solution. And so beyond protests and calls, are there other ways that the council, voters, or businesses can apply pressure? Keep speaking out. You have to keep speaking out. I'll say we had a council meeting and had some caucus meetings this week where 50 people are of a variety of different opinions, and we all support different residents. And I can't even imagine what Congress is like, Jan. I only have to work with 49 other colleagues, but people are feeling the pressure, and people are also in this moment for change. So anything you can do to encourage residents, friends, family members in other communities who have other city council representatives to get engaged and to share their voice, that will make a difference. But FOP contract changes and reforms, maybe even really evaluating as a city of Chicago whether that relationship should continue, I think is on the table as well. And I know, Mary, I want to get to a couple other questions here. Some folks, Mary says that she's really tried to stay engaged with the CAPS program here in the ward and our broader district over the past 12 years, but has seen a real drop off in participation in the past 2 years. And what can we do to re-engage or provide better opportunities and forums for direct discussion between members of the community and our police? Mary, I think that's a fantastic question. And I know that our district here and our ward has a long history with the CAPS program. It was one of the first places, right, to devise that. I can also say that I know that there are lots of residents who are very active in that CAPS program and work from the space of trying to build stronger community policing bonds. Community policing, kind of investing in getting to know those officers and making sure the officers know people in the neighborhood has long been a strong and I think valiant effort. I, from a personal space, think that the more we can know each other as individuals, the better relationships that we have and we're able to work together. And I also know that a lot of things haven't changed in Chicago. While locally within our district or within your beat, you get to know those officers. And, here in the 24th district, I think we're a little more fortunate than most. And also the broader reforms and the abuses of power, the lawsuits, the misconduct charges, those things haven't changed. And I have heard from people that some of that drop in participation, both from the community side and from the police department side, is because people are losing faith in those types of processes because we're not seeing the changes that we need to see.
Exactly. I mean, if people don't feel that they're actually making big decisions or even small decisions that matter, then I think it's discouraging to be part of a process like that, as you said. I don't know. I mean, I don't know how the CAPS program has worked in our district that much, and I think that the concept is good, but has it really been able to make changes that we need?
Jan, a question specifically for you. A question about what happened with the report from the Obama era police task force, and was any of that included in the new legislation being introduced?
I do believe that some of it was. I don't know if my notes indicate to me exactly what was included from the Obama era. I have this vision in the White House of a huge whiteboard that has all the things that Barack Obama did. And the goal every day is to at least erase one or more of those. So certainly the spirit of the changes that we're making are much more in line with the Obama administration, but I really can't speak to exact proposals that have been taken from that. I can get back to you on that.
Great. Thank you, Jan. Let's see. There's a question here about what we need to do to get police out of schools and what we need to do to make the police department pay for their own lawsuits from their own budget. So there's two questions. One, I'll say, I mentioned it a little earlier, but for folks who weren't on earlier, today in City Council, I co-sponsored an ordinance that Alderman Sawyer, Alderman Ramirez Rosa, and Alderman Taylor from the 6th, 35th, and 20th wards respectively introduced, specifically doing that from the city side, us working to end our contractual agreement to allow our Chicago City Police Departments to be in Chicago Public Schools, as they are a separate agency. It's not a foolproof total solution, but it was what after some research we learned that we could do as a city council. So I am supporting that. We'll hopefully get to have hearings on that in July, this coming month. But I'll say Chicago Public Schools leaves the decision around school resource officers up to individual local school councils. If you're not on a local school council, or if you're not sure how to get involved, you can look up your local school council. I'll make sure we share links through our pages. Get engaged with your local school council. Talk to the members. There are parent members, community members, there are staff members that are all part of that elected body. We have elections every 2 years. Let them know what you think. I can say we only have one school in the 49th ward for our Rogers Park schools where there are police officers. That's Sullivan High School and the LSC.
My alma mater.
Yeah, that LSC and their student representatives as well. They all voted unanimously to keep that school resource officer. And I'll say a lot of that comes down to the individual relationships. So it's a complex issue. But there will be board meetings coming up for the Chicago Public Schools Board where they will be revisiting that issue this summer. So we'll definitely share kind of dates and steps on how you can take action on that from that side. And then to the question around budgets and making them pay for lawsuits. So the police department is part of the city. So their lawsuits are our lawsuits. And that's one of the hardest parts when we look at our budget. There were changes made in the 2020 budget that put more money in the police budget that was to cover their projected lawsuits. But this is one of the elephants in the room of how do we stop getting these misconduct lawsuits, and how do we as the taxpayers and as the city not be on the hook for them. And I'll say their budgets and their mistakes are our budgets and our mistakes as well. Let's see.
We're talking about how much money. We're talking in some cases millions of dollars, right?
Millions of dollars, hundreds of millions of dollars over the last several years. Let's see. Lots of good questions here. Here's a good one. Besides mental health, what other services could kind of new community 911 services offer, right? Like what do we think that future could look like? What types of, what would reimagining public safety look like?
So I was reading a number of the functions that the police do that really don't have to be done by the police at all. One of them that I didn't mention, and it is a form of kind of police force, is ICE. There's a lot of conversation about the function of ICE and deportations and the kind of way that immigrants are treated. It's a very similar conversation to the one that we're having about the policing in cities, and so we need to make changes right there. But, even just taking accident reports or responding to noise complaints. If you look at the everyday functions of now the police force, that doesn't have to be. And you can have people located in communities that can, and hired much more broadly around the city, that can do these kinds of functions. And that's the kind of thing we need to be thinking about broadly right now. And that's why I appreciate your suggestions and your input on that. And I don't know if the questioner had something in particular in mind about, but there has been a lot of talk about mental health issues and sending social workers and professionals to deal with these kinds of questions. But imagine if, and I'm sorry, I don't remember his name, in Georgia, who was drunk and fell asleep in the line waiting, for, was it fast food, and ended up dead. If some other kind of professional had gone out, someone is sleeping, is fallen asleep, looks like they're drunk in the car, do you really need an armed police person to go there to deal with that situation? I don't think so. I mean, he did get involved with the taser, but tasers don't kill. And so I just think de-escalating, and thinking about the police force that needs to be used is how we determine who goes to the scene of an incident of any sort.
Yeah. Rayshard Brooks, the gentleman in Atlanta.
Yeah.
Yeah. We're getting close to time. I do want to share Christine Bell here. Thanks for sharing this, Christine. As we were talking about like how we change police culture, as we talk about the training piece, Christine shares here that they belong to a building trade. And when that trade wanted to change the culture of lunchtime drinking, they, and for dropouts to be educated professionals, that trade invested in their apprenticeship program, she writes, and that most building trades have a 4-year program, and the cost of that program is on the members, not the taxpayers. And her question, is there anything in the works for the police to start an apprenticeship to not only better train, but to change a culture? Christine, not that I know of, is my very short answer, but I really appreciate you sharing this example. And I think that adds to that conversation of what we could do differently there.
Yes, I totally agree with that. But again, the underlying policy then is the thing that we have to look for. How are we defining what these culturally appropriate things? How when we do training, what's acceptable, what's not acceptable? Very often in the police, it's families get involved in policing, and it's often my dad was a cop and I'm a cop, which is, I have no problem with that, except that we have to adapt. We have to change what it means to be a cop, and then have an apprenticeship program that teaches those values.
Yeah. I'm going to take our last question here from Stevie, who is 15. And Stevie asks, what are our opinions on police militarization being a form of institutional silencing by acting as if the protesters voicing their opinions were dangerous? And then how do we design or redesign the system to be racially and economically just? Big question, Stevie.
Big question. Wow, I'm proud of you just for the question. It does remind me of one of the things during the Obama administration, that the no military equipment was allowed to go to local police forces, and so the militarization, the arming of the police departments with these kinds of weapons of war now is legal. but it certainly wasn't in the Obama administration. So that is one thing. I think you were really having kind of a broader question, but I wanted to mention that specific one.
And I'll say, Stevie, I think that to the first question, the way through our protests, the way protesters were treated as dangerous, um, was very troubling to me. So especially we had this direct contrast, right, of not the week before dealing with actually armed protesters taking over state house buildings, right, in some states. But they were protesting for reopening, right, and they were largely white and, largely white men, a lot of them. And, actually seeing people with like AR-15s and assault rifles and weapons and militarized gear that were, civilians in state house buildings, and seeing that there was a response to give them their First Amendment rights in their space. And, and then the next week, I watched some footage from Columbus, Ohio, my hometown, and protesters were out for several hours on the first night of protest. And it wasn't until militarized police force decided that, like, somebody gave an order for dispersal. It wasn't until they started, pepper spraying people and dispersing the crowd that, property damage occurred or that chaos ensued as people ran and as tensions really exploded. And I think that we saw that play out at time and time again, over our several weeks of protest, where that militarization escalated a conflict. It escalated something, and that people out protesting, demonstrating their First Amendment rights, unarmed people, were treated as a dangerous threat. And that really gets to the core of how we manage, maintain, and promote a healthy democracy. Whose ideas are dangerous, whose presence is dangerous. And we need to see, we might think we have an answer in our head, and we might, as individuals, have a certain belief, but certainly what we saw play out in the actions that decision makers made in cities from Chicago to Seattle was that certain people are considered more dangerous and certain ideas are considered more dangerous. And a lot of times that depends on the color of your skin or the amount of money in your bank account.
If I could just say, I think we're going to hear from the president in this really unwise rally that he's going to have, putting thousands, probably, I'm sure, of people indoors in a dangerous situation because of COVID-19. But I think you'll also hear about Second Amendment rights, and there'll be a lot of we call them dog whistle kinds of comments that will really stir up the audience against the protesters. So let me just end with this. When we talk about change, elections really matter. And I think it's really important that the demonstrations, which I think have in and of themselves are going to make change, those changes are going to be sealed with who gets chosen to be the leaders in our country. And I know, Stevie, you can't vote, 15 years old, but you can certainly talk to people. And most of the people, I think, that are probably listening, this election is the most important in my lifetime, which is pretty long now. And I think that for the reason of trying to get a handle on this worldwide pandemic, as well as the pandemic of racism that we're experiencing, that it has to be expressed also by voting. And so I just really want to emphasize that and encourage everyone that can to get everyone to vote, hopefully by mail. Illinois will be able to do that.
Mm-hmm.
Not everywhere, but unless we get that change. That's part of our legislation in the HEROES Act, is to get universal vote by mail and early voting, so that every American has the right to cast their ballot safely in the next election.
Congresswoman Schakowsky, thank you so much for joining us. 49th Ward residents, 9th District residents, thank you for joining us tonight for this virtual town hall. I know there were questions that we did not get to answer directly. We are copying them down. We will make sure to get answers to you over the next day or two, and we'll share them in the event. Since we're both hosts on the event, I think we can share those answers in the event. Thank you all for your questions, for your engagement. That's my dog you hear.
Yes, you heard my dog earlier.
Yeah, because we have dogs in our home offices now. But thank you for your time, Congresswoman. Thank you for being a great, strong representative for us here. We're proud to have you. And I appreciate everyone's time this evening.
Thank you all.
Oh, and also, my quick don't forget is if you're not on the Congresswoman's email list, or if you're not on mine and you live in our districts, please make sure to check out our websites and sign up.
And you can also call 773-506-7100. We're not at the office right now. And by the way, we're going to be closed for Juneteenth on Friday, unless it's an emergency. But if you call that number, you'll get an answer very quickly in return. So thank you.
Yeah.
And thank you so much, Alderwoman. I really appreciate it.
Oh, thank you. This was fun. So we're going to end our live stream, and we'll make this recording available probably by tomorrow. My computer gets slow. So thank you all.
Okay.